All right. We have our next player here, so.
Didn't show up, didn't have people with registration, so. You have to rebound yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. Did you? Ensure that it's not
Right.
Right, that's what I meant. Well, we I'm still learning some points in the spectrum. So you're still in front of us. Right, this tough one. It's done afterwards. Interesting. Yes. You could sign in, or you could check your name off, or sign in if you didn't turn register. You could sign in, sir. Sir, could you just check your name off the list? All right. We have kind of a full house today, and I would like to know, just at the very beginning, did anyone park in the garage? You did? Here, I'll give you a pass to get out. I think it's your first hours are pretty, but it might run over just in case. Anyone else park in the town garage? Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right.
So there may be a few people that are coming in after the fact, so they'll have to take the seats down front or wherever. So hopefully they won't clamber all over you. A special welcome to everyone. We have just celebrated the library's 100th anniversary and invite you to pick up a copy of the Town of Leesburg Celebrates Thomas Balch Library's 100 Years. Copies of the current Balch column listing programs, classes, and exhibits are available on the table in the back of the room, along with other informative literature about the library. Events are posted on our website and on social media. Our newsletter may be accessed in their entirety on our website. For your awareness, the library is owned and operated by the Town of Leesburg, and it has established its own catalog separate from Loudoun County Public Library, and we've converted from the Dewey to the Library of Congress classification system. Visit our website, take a stroll through our new Centennial catalog. It provides access to information on all of our holdings, regardless of the media. So manuscripts will be listed in there, maps, everything, which previously they were not. For those who may not know, the water fountain is out the door to your left. The restrooms are straight back. And if you have any kind of an electronic device, if you can please either turn off or mute at this time, everyone will be very happy. Especially this event, just for general knowledge, this event is being recorded and will be made available on the library's YouTube. So just be aware it is being recorded. It is my pleasure to welcome Betsy Arnett as our guest speaker today. Betsy, who holds a master's degree in public history from the University of South Carolina, has worked for the Town of Leesburg for over 20 years. She is currently Senior Management Analyst for the town. Betsy has written a number of guided walking tours of downtown. You may take these tours from your internet browser or download an app to your phone. Visit the town website and check out under Visitors for Walking Tours. Please welcome Betsy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for joining me this morning. This is quite the crowd. So to give you a little background on how it came to be that the Senior Management Analyst is doing a presentation on a brief history of the town of Leesburg, we do orientation for new employees. And part of that orientation has always been a brief history. And a couple of years ago, right before an orientation, someone from HR called me and said, "Hey, Betsy, the person who normally does the history presentation is going to be out. Can you do the history presentation?" And I thought, yeah, sure. How hard could that be? And she sent me the presentation, and I could not make heads or tails of it because the person who had traditionally been doing this told stories. He was so well versed in history that he would just like show a picture and he would tell the whole story about it. And so I took the presentation and in 2 days did what I could with it. Alexandra was actually at orientation with me. We kind of stumbled our way through the presentation. And afterwards, Alexandra and I talked and I said, we really need to have a presentation that someone with notes that someone could pick up pretty easily and do. And so I started working on this, and then she got a call from Spring Arbor, the assisted living facility, wanting someone to come do a program for their residents. And so she called me and said, "Hey, would you like to debut your new history?" And so I did. And so I gave that last year. And so that's how this presentation has come about. And so now we have hopefully someone could just pick this up and run with it and not struggle like I did with the previous one. Oh, and the other previous one ended right after World War II. And I thought, well, surely there's been history for the last 70 years. So I have attempted to bring it further up to date. So thank you again for joining me. And without further ado, a brief history of the town of Leesburg. So the early history of the town, obviously, there were, native inhabitants of this area. And in this area, they were members of the Siouan and Algonquian nations. But the first written record of an encounter between whites and native peoples took place in 1699. Two plantation owners from what is now Stafford County, Burr Harrison, whose descendants later lived here in Leesburg, and Giles Vanderkessel traveled to this area on behalf of the governor to make a treaty with the native peoples. And Mr. Harrison recorded in his diary a meeting with members of the Piscataway tribe of the Algonquian Nation. Now, the Piscataway were originally from what is now Maryland, and they had been pushed south by settlement in Maryland. Now, obviously, over the next couple of decades, more and more whites moved into this area, culminating eventually in the Great Treaty of 1722, which Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, along with the governors of New York and Pennsylvania, signed with the Five Nations of the Iroquois. And in that treaty, the Iroquois relinquished their claim to the land east of the Blue Ridge. And that really opened up this area to non-native settlements. There are, however, also anecdotal stories that by that time, the native population had been pretty much decimated by smallpox. So now I'm going to go backwards in time for a second and talk about the Northern Neck Proprietary. In 1649, Charles II granted a tract of land known as the Northern Neck Proprietary to a group of English noblemen. Now, this was a political move on Charles's part because he was not, in fact, King of England at the time. He was in exile in Europe. And so this was a political move to get their support for him to regain the throne. Now, they all had much larger reasons to support him, their own necks mostly, rather than the promise of some piece of unsurveyed land in the wilds of the backwoods of Virginia. They did all, however, support him, and he did regain the throne. Now, the proprietary was described in its original grant as being all of the land between the heads or head springs and waters of the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. And after Charles was restored to the throne, and the grant was then at that point legally recognized in 1660, there were 6 shares of the proprietary. Now, 2 of the original grantees were brothers, John Culpeper and his brother. John's son, Thomas, inherited his share, his father's share. So he had 1 share. A cousin of his had another share. And then Thomas purchased the other 4 shares from either the original grantees or their heirs. And so the Culpepers ended up owning and controlling the entire Northern Neck proprietary. And in 1719, Thomas Culpepper's grandson, Thomas Fairfax, the 6th Lord Fairfax of Cameron, inherited all 6 shares. So he inherited the 5 shares that his grandfather had accumulated. And then his mother was Catherine Culpeper, and he inherited the 6th share from her. She had inherited it from a cousin. So at this point, then, Thomas owned the entire Northern Neck proprietary. Now, about the same time, the colony of Virginia contested Fairfax's both his ownership of the proprietary as well as the southern boundary of it. The northern boundary is the Potomac River. The southern boundary was the Rappahannock, right? On the other side of the Potomac River, of course, is the colony of Maryland. There was no contest about that, but they contested the southern boundary. In 1746, the Privy Council of London actually found, after a 10-year legal battle, found in Lord Fairfax's favor that he owned it, and they established the boundaries of it. And the boundaries actually included 5.2 million acres of land. And this is a map. This is a map. Sorry. There we go. This is a map of the Northern Neck proprietary overlaid on the modern counties in Virginia and what is now West Virginia. And so, huge area. Now, from the beginning, the Culpepers and the Fairfaxes after them, of course, saw the Northern Neck proprietary as a source of income. That was the whole point of getting a land grant from the king, so you could become wealthier, right? And so they established their own plantations. Thomas Culpeper was actually a colonial governor at one time, and while he was here, he spent more time looking after his own property than he did looking after the affairs of the colony. They established their own plantations, they leased out land, and they sold parcels of land. Now, this map that I'm showing you here is the 1757 map of Loudoun County. But shortly after coming into possession of the Northern Neck proprietary, Thomas Fairfax sold about 4,000 acres in the area of what is now Leesburg. Now, today, just to give you a sense of the size of that, today the corporate limits of the town of Leesburg are a little over 8,000 acres. So about half of what is today Leesburg was sold by Lord Fairfax. Now, the property changed hands a number of times over the years, and the owners leased out a lot of land, and in particular, they leased out land right around the crossroads of 2 very important trade routes. And a settlement then sprang up at this crossroads between the north-south Carolina Road, which showed up in blue on this map, and the east-west Alexandria or Shenandoah Road. And of course, these 2 roads still exist today. And in fact, I drove one of them on my way here. So that is, of course, north-south is Highway 15 and east-west is Route 7. So Loudoun County was originally part of Fairfax County. Actually, it was originally part of Northumberland County. All of the Northern Neck proprietary was Northumberland County, and then it was subsequently subdivided as enough settlement occurred that there needed to be a courthouse close enough that people could go to. So Northumberland County and then Westmoreland County was subdivided from that, and then Stafford County, and Prince William County, and Fairfax County. So by 1757, enough settlement had occurred in this area that the Virginia House of Burgesses decided that they needed to subdivide this from Fairfax County and establish a new courthouse. Now, one of the men who leased land from the owner, John Carlisle, was a man named Nicholas Minor. He owned a tavern in the Crossroads settlement, and he purchased from John Carlisle 326 acres of land, and he paid a surveyor named John Huff to plat 60 of those acres into a town of 70 lots. And this is the map. This is the Huff plan of Leesburg. I'm going to show you a blow up of that, an enlargement of that in a second. But Minor did a delay in this. Minor named his new town Georgetown in honor of King George II, who was then the reigning monarch. The House of Burgesses did, in fact, select Minor's town as the new seat for Loudoun County, but they renamed it Leesburg in honor of the Lee family. Thomas Lee was the patriarch of the Lee family. He had passed in 1750. Two of his sons, Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot Lee, were both named as trustees, along with Nicholas Minor, of the new town. And Richard Henry and Francis Lightfoot went on to be signers of the Declaration of Independence, the only brothers to sign the Declaration. Now, in case you're ever asked, as I was literally asked not more than 2 weeks ago, so is Leesburg named for Robert E. Lee? The answer is no. We were founded in 1758. Robert E. Lee didn't become famous as the commander-in-chief of the Confederate forces until the 1860s, over 100 years later. Thomas Lee is, however, an ancestor of Robert E. Lee's. So this is a sorry. There we go. It's going to come in a second. There's a bit of a delay in this. There we go. So this is the original plan of Leesburg. This is an 1859 copy of the original 1858. And you can see that the streets still exist today. King Street, Royal Street, Loudoun Street, Market Street, Cornwall Street. Back Street, of course, is today Wirt Street. That's been renamed. But the rest of the streets and that grid still exists today. So when Nicholas Minor began spelling off the lots in the new town, he required new property owners to build a brickstone or wood house, at least 16 feet by 20 feet, at least 9 feet high at the eaves. And the reason for this is that he wanted his town to be a respectable town. The early accounts of the settlement that preceded Leesburg described it as rather indifferently built, which we take to mean it was a bit ramshackle. And if people did not comply with these covenants that were in the deeds, the property would revert to Minor. And there were indeed cases that did happen, that he took the property back. And there are two of these so-called covenant houses that still exist in Leesburg today that are easily recognizable in their mostly their original form. The first is the William Baker House, which is the old stone house on Loudoun Street Southwest. Now, the dormers are a later addition, and you can see that there's been a large addition, a brick addition to the back of that house. And the other one, of course, is the Donaldson Silversmith cabin, a log cabin on Loudoun Street. Now, the Silversmith cabin, from about shoulder height up, is a reconstruction. So this became, it was a dry cleaners building. It was used as a dry cleaners. And when that area where it stands was cleared in order to make way for the construction of the new town hall and the town parking garage, that's when that building was slated for demolition. And it was discovered to be an original covenant house. And it was not in good repair. And there was a large campaign to raise money to restore it. But again, from about shoulder height up, just above the door, so maybe more than shoulder, maybe my head height. It's a complete reconstruction, and of course, it never would have looked like this when it was built. This dates from the 1760s. It would have been covered with siding. The chinking would not have been left exposed to the elements because it would have eroded, and you'd spend all of your time repairing your house.
Are they open for touring?
So that building is owned by the Town of Leesburg, and I'm not sure exactly what's going on with it now. We were using it as an office, and I don't know what's happening with it now. In the past, the Loudon Museum occupied it, and they did have it open regularly. So that would be a great question to follow up on. Whether it's going to be open. Now, there are other covenant houses that do exist, but they've been incorporated into larger buildings. A house was added onto. I believe the back of the Birkby House is actually an original covenant house. The fortunate case is Liberty Street. So during the Revolutionary War period, well, before the Revolutionary War, during the colonial era, of course, the Church of England was the official state church, and they collected tithes or taxes from all citizens, regardless of whether they were members of the church or not. And any non-Church of England congregation was considered a dissenter, and they had to get permission from the crown through the colonial governor in order to operate, in order to hold services, in order to own property in the colonies. And Leesburg and Loudoun County had a substantial number of dissenters. We had congregations of Quakers, of Methodists, Lutherans, Baptists, Presbyterians, and that reflects the settlement patterns of this area, that a lot of people in this northern part of Virginia actually had come down, from Pennsylvania and Maryland and settled in this area. So Germans and Scots Irish, and not just the English from the Tidewater region. In 1766, Nicholas Minor sold a lot in his town to a man named Robert Hamilton, who was a trustee of the Methodist Church, and he sold this lot to him for no other use but for a church or meeting house and graveyard. And this makes Leesburg home to the earliest known property in the United States owned by the Methodist Church. And so it is still. Sorry?
What year?
1766.
Okay, thank you.
And so this cemetery, this is a photo of the old stone church, the old Methodist church. This building was demolished around 1900. The cemetery still exists, as well as you can see the outline of the foundation of this church. Streets. It is owned today by the Methodist Church. It actually changed hands, and then the Methodist Church reacquired it. But it is considered one of the Methodist Church's most important heritage sites in the United States. By the beginning of the Revolutionary War, Leesburg had grown to about 500 residents, and in 1774, a group of Loudoun property owners met at the Loudoun County Courthouse, and they adopted what are known as the Loudoun County Resolves, which was a statement regarding the taxation issues facing the colonies at the time. And it was a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. A lot of these resolves were passed in various places around. And a copy of the Loudoun County Resolves was sent to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, as well as a copy was sent to London. And I believe that, the presence of so many dissenters and in this area, that there was more sentiment towards independence than might otherwise have been if everybody had been, English in origin. During the war, although there were no major Revolutionary War battles fought in this area, during the war, every free man in Loudoun was enrolled. And by 1781, Loudoun had stood up the largest militia in Virginia. So a few interesting facts about Leesburg, things that have occurred. In 1803, the Leesburg Volunteer Fire Company was established. So we've had a volunteer fire company here in Leesburg for 220 years. In 1811, a new courthouse was constructed, replacing the original one built in 1761. This is a photograph of the 1811 courthouse. The courthouse that exists today is the third one to stand on that site. In February 1813, the town was incorporated by the General Assembly. Now, we were chartered in 1758, and that's what we count our founding from. But we were incorporated in 1813, and what that meant was that we were given the legal authority to elect officials and to enact ordinances. And so the new government consisted of a mayor, a recorder, and an elected council. They were all elected on an annual basis. And a man named John Rhodes served as the first mayor of Leesburg. Yes, sir.
Yeah, prior to that time, how did they administer Leesburg? Was it just, how did they go about doing it?
That's a good question. So, I think people were appointed to, to handle.
Senior respect.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Now, during the War of 1812, in August of 1814, the British invaded Washington, and they set fire to a number of buildings, including the presidential mansion, which was not at that time known as the White House, and the Capitol building. And in advance of the British invasion, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and other important documents from the federal archives, including former President Washington's correspondence, were loaded into wagons. So they were brought to Leesburg, where they were stored in an empty house on Wirt Street. Or at least that's our story. There are competing stories that it was actually a house on Cornwall Street, and that it was also that they were taken to the Rokeby estate south of Leesburg. There's no evidence. I mean, the fact that they were brought out here is pretty well established, but there's no evidence as to where exactly they were stored. We're going to stick with the story that they were stored here in Leesburg, empty house on Wirt Street. So we were at one time the home of the National Archives. So in 1814, the town limits were expanded, more than doubling the size of the town to include an additional 5 acres. In 1817, the town held a lottery to raise $3,000 to pave the streets. Can you imagine trying to do that today? And in 1820, the Leesburg Turnpike opened, connecting Leesburg with DC, essentially, in the Little River Turnpike system. By 1830, the turnpike was extended westward, connecting Leesburg to the Shenandoah Valley. In 1821, wooden pipes were installed to carry water from a spring west of town. And in 2008, a section of this wooden pipe was discovered on the Rock Spring Farm. So that's where the spring was. The spring still exists, still produces water, right there at the corner of Loudon Street and Dry Mill Road. But so we have one of the oldest municipal water systems in Virginia, and this is a section of the original pipe. It's in our utilities building of Russell Branch Parkway. So from August of 1824 to September 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette, the last surviving French general who served in the American Revolution and the hero of the siege of Yorktown, made a farewell tour visit to the United States. He was invited by then President Monroe, and during this tour, he visited all 24 states and was here to witness the 1824 presidential election and then the March 1825 inauguration of President John Quincy Adams. And towards the end of his tour, he visited former President James Monroe at his own home, Oak Hill, located just south of Leesburg. The house still exists today. It is privately owned. And a banquet was held in his honor in Leesburg. And President John Quincy Adams came out from D.C. to attend that. And an estimated 8,000 people attended this banquet and festivities on the Loudoun County Courthouse lawn. It was considered the social event of the century. So the Civil War, by the 1850 census. So the first U.S. census was conducted in 1790. But the 1850 census is the first census in which the population of the town of Leesburg was called out separately from the overall population of Loudoun County. Previously, it was just sort of like magisterial districts. But by 1850, it was, we have specific, this is the first time we have specific numbers for the population of Leesburg. It was about 1,700 residents, and it dipped. Our population dipped after the Civil War, but by 1880, it recovered to about 1,700, and it remained that population until 1950. So this is the 1853 Yardley-Taylor map showing continued growth of the town. I'm going to show you an enlargement of that in just a second. In the 1860 presidential elections, the constitutional union candidate John Bell received 60% of the votes in Loudoun County. Now, the 1860 presidential election was, for all intents and purposes, two separate elections, one in the north and one in the south. So in the north, the contest was between the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, and the Democratic Party candidate, Stephen Douglas. In the south, the contest was between the Constitutional Union candidate, John Bell, and the Southern Democratic Party candidate, John Breckinridge. The Republicans did not even appear on the ballot in the 10 slave states. And so the Constitutional Union Party, while they certainly supported slavery, they did not support secession. And so my point of saying this in this presentation is to show that there was not overwhelming support for secession here in Loudoun County. And in fact, in April of 1861, the two Loudoun delegates to the Virginia Secession Convention both voted against secession. The ordinance, however, was adopted by the convention, and a month later, Leesburg men, being the only ones who could vote at the time, overwhelmingly ratified the ordinance in support of secession, and the Civil War began. So this is the plan of Leesburg. You can see, we've expanded some. You can see the Leesburg Turnpike there. Air Street is, although it's not labeled, is there. North Street. So during the Civil War, many Leesburg men enlisted in the mostly in the 8th Virginia Infantry and the 6th Virginia Cavalry. Quakers and Germans in Lovettsville and Waterford formed Loudoun's only Union unit, the Loudoun Rangers. And in May of 1861, the Leesburg Town Council authorized the printing of its own paper currency, known as dog money, because it had a picture of the mayor's dog on it. By the end of the war, nearly $100,000 of this dog money had been issued. Of course, technically, it was completely illegal. So the Battle of Balch Bluff is the only significant battle to be fought in Leesburg or in the vicinity of Leesburg, and it was actually not a planned battle at all. It was a mistake. So throughout the fall of 1861, Leesburg was occupied by Confederate troops under the command of Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans. And on the morning of October 21st, 1861, so this is still fairly early in the war, based on a faulty intelligence report, the Union Army was occupying Harrison Island in the middle of the Potomac River, right across from Falls Bluff. They sent a raiding party across the river to attack a Confederate camp that actually didn't exist. Someone had seen something in the woods. They thought it was a camp. It wasn't. What they encountered instead, sorry, this is a map of the battle, was a company of Mississippi infantrymen, and fighting ensued. And so you can see this map. I apologize, it's not great, but you can see the river and Harrison Island, and then on the left is Falls Bluff. So as fighting ensues, Colonel Edward Baker arrives on Harrison Island, and he orders as many troops as possible to cross the river in support of this raiding party. Unfortunately, Edward Baker was not well-versed in logistics, and there weren't enough boats to support getting folks across in an efficient manner, and a bottleneck ensued. And by early afternoon, or late in the afternoon, the Union began to retreat. And so the Confederates were holding the high ground of the bluff. The Union troops are trying to retreat back across the river to Harrison Island. A lot of troops drowned in the river. There were lots of reports of Confederates shooting at the retreating soldiers, which was, considered against modern conventions of war. They're retreating, you let them go. So this was a really small skirmish. It took place during one day, but it had an enormous or an outsized impact for such a small battle. So first of all, about 1,700 Union troops crossed the river, and 223 were killed, including 166 who drowned in the river trying to retreat, 226 wounded, and 553 were captured. One of the ones who was killed was Union Colonel Edward Baker. And he remains the only sitting senator to be killed in battle. He was also a personal friend of President Lincoln's. The Confederates had about the same number of troops involved in the battle, but far fewer casualties. And what were the major impacts of this? Well, first of all, bodies of the Union dead floated down the Potomac River to Washington, D.C., which led to public outcries about the conduct of the war, along with the reports of the savagery of the Confederates firing on the retreating soldiers. It really shocked and horrified a lot of the public at the time. It was the death of a sitting senator, as I mentioned. It was also the third consecutive Union defeat following Bull Run or Manassas, depending upon how you care to phrase that, and Wilson's Creek. And it led directly to the establishment of the first Congressional Joint Committee on the conduct of the war. So small battle, big impact. During the winter of 1861 to 1862, 3 forts were built by the Confederate Army on the hills surrounding Leesburg. Fort Beauregard is gone. It's now Beauregard Estates Housing Development. Fort Johnston to the west of us does still exist, although I think they just changed the name of that road. So the site of it still exists. And then the site of Fort Evans also still exists. This is a plan of the fort. And this is an aerial photograph that, if you can see on the left, is the Route 15 bypass. At the top is Edwards Ferry Road. So it's on the Rahal property. So it's kind of like behind the new Home to Suites Hotel on Fort Evans Road, if you're familiar with it. It's behind the new DMV. Okay.
Yeah.
You know where that is.
Yeah.
Right. So in March of 1862, the Union Army occupied Leesburg for the first time, and George Fox, the clerk of the court, evacuated Loudoun County's records to Leesburg, and that's why they survived. And so Loudoun County is very unique in Virginia in having their complete land records from the very beginning, from 1757 to today. In September 1862, Confederate Army recaptured Leesburg. General Robert E. Lee took up residence at Harrison Hall on North King Street. It's now known as the Glenfiddich House. And it was there that he met with Generals Jackson, Stewart, and Longstreet to plan their advance across the Potomac River in what became the Antietam Campaign. In June of 1864, General Jubal Early and his troops passed through downtown Leesburg, chased by Union troops after his aborted attack on Washington, D.C. And all told, by the end of the war, Leesburg had changed hands about 150 times between the Union and the Confederacy. And I think that's only exceeded by Winchester in terms of number of times it changed hands, as a city changed hands. So during Reconstruction, like the rest of Virginia, Leesburg was battered and broke in the years following the Civil War. When I first put this presentation together and I shared it with my mother, she said, "Don't you mean broken?" Being the grammarian that she is. I said, no, broke. There was no money. But Leesburg's industries, the businesses that were here in town, generally supported the agrarian economy of Loudoun. So there were things like mills and packing plants and slaughterhouses and that sort of thing, and along the railroad. And so that helped our recovery as proximity to Washington as a destination for these goods helped our economic recovery. Rail service to and from Alexandria, which had reached Leesburg prior to the war and had been suspended during the war, was restored in 1867. But by 1900, the rail line had only been extended as far as Bluemont to the east, and it never crossed the mountain. This photo is the passenger station, which was demolished. It was located where Georgetown Park is today. The freight station was located further east along the rail line at about Harrison Street, and it has been incorporated into the Market Station development. It's the home of Fireworks Pizza. By the 1870 census, the population had dropped to under 1,200 folks. And then this is an 1878 map of Leesburg, showing how much more development had occurred, how the town had continued to grow and fill in. So,
Excuse me.
yeah.
Can we see those maps today somewhere? Can we go to a location and see them?
Yes, so the Balch has copies of them. There are digital copies online as well. So if you want to take another look at this, this is actually I've zoomed in on this, so it's a larger map. Yes, miss.
Any idea where the Black settlement might have been from the?
So along Loudon Street, and then this area. So here's Loudon, and so this area generally was the Black area of town. So as the in the late 19th century, as the economy recovered, we saw more development here in Leesburg. Karlheim, a large Victorian mansion. This is a rare example of Victorian Italianate architecture here in Leesburg. It was built for Pennsylvania industrials Charles Paxton and his wife in the 1870s when their daughter died young. And when Rachel died, she left the house and her estate to create the Paxton Convalescent Home for children. It later became an orphanage. It is now the home of the Ark of Loudon. They used to host Shocktober haunted house in here. Unfortunately, the house is in very poor condition at this point. And so they aren't allowed to do that anymore. Have anyone in the house, which is very unfortunate that the house has fallen into the disrepair it has. In 1880, the first telephone was installed in town. And in 1887, the town council engaged the Norris Brothers, a local building company, to construct a building at the corner of Loudon and King Streets. The two-story building cost $15,000, and it contained the town offices, retail shops, and a 450-seat theater on the second floor. It was known as the Leesburg Opera House. It was demolished in 1956 to make way for White's Department Store, which is now the home of Senor Ramon Taqueria and Echelon Wine Bar and the Sunflower Shack and those buildings there right on the northeast corner of King and Loudon Street.
Left out bricks and mortar.
What?
Left out bricks.
Oh, brick and mortar. Yeah, sorry. So the Norris Brothers are actually responsible for a great deal of how Leesburg looks today. They built a lot of the buildings from the late 19th century that have survived. In 1891, electricity was installed in town, although the line only ran from West Market to Cornwall Street. And then in 1895, the Norris Brothers built the current Loudon County Courthouse. This is the third courthouse to exist on that site. It is an excellent example of classical revival architecture, and it's a beautiful building.
You know, where was the generation of electricity? Was there a little?
I don't know that. I don't know where it would.
It was a dam on Goose Creek.
Dam on Goose.
A dam on Goose Creek. Thank you for sharing
In
that.
fact, it's the same one that's there now.
Thank you.
So Leesburg remained the center of commerce. So Leesburg never had a great deal of industry here, and we were always a market town, serving the agricultural economy of Loudon County. And so during the late 19th century, the beef and dairy cattle Farms grew up in this area. Corn replaced wheat as the cash crop. And so Leesburg, being, the market town where the railroad came through, served those industries. In 1917, Westmoreland Davis, who was the wet candidate, meaning he supported alcohol, sailed alcohol, was elected the governor of Virginia. Now, Davis grew up in Richmond. His family lost their fortune during the Civil War. He then attended Virginia Military Institute and then moved to New York, where he attended Columbia Law School and made his fortune as a lawyer. In 1903, he and his wife, Marguerite, purchased Morven Park, which is the estate just north of Leesburg. And so we consider Westmoreland Davis to be our governor of Virginia. He took up farming, even though he had no background in it. He took up farming. He founded the Loudon Hunt. He served as the master of foxhounds for the hunt. And in 1912, he purchased the Southern Planter Journal, a newspaper that he published until his death in the 1940s. And through that, through the journal, he advocated for farming reforms and the use of scientific methods to improve productivity. As I've already said, he was elected governor in 1917 as the Democratic candidate, despite being vehemently opposed to the Democratic machine in power at the time. But he was a reform governor. He's responsible for the creation of our state highway system, as well as other modern state government. And he served from 1918 to 1922 and came back to Leesburg and passed away in 1942 here in Leesburg. The Leesburg Hospital opened its building on Cornwall Street in 1918. The hospital had previously occupied a house on West Market Street, and then they built this building. This building, unfortunately, is now gone. And the current hospital that is there on Cornwall Street stands where it was. Actually, I think where it was is a parking lot. Almost 600 Loudoners served in World War I. And in July 1919, Leesburg hosted a homecoming parade for the veterans. And in 1922, the memorial was dedicated on the Loudoun County Courthouse grounds. And you can see that now. And this is a photograph of the crowd there on the courthouse grounds at that dedication ceremony. In 1922, the Balch Library opened. This building opened as a private subscription library, although it was a segregated library. In 1925, Leesburg High School was constructed. It later became, this building still exists. It later became Leesburg Elementary School, and then it was the administrative buildings for the school system, and it is today one of the county's senior centers. In 1927, Leesburg Fire Company's new station was built on Loudon Street. It's now an art gallery on Loudon Street. And then in 1931, the Tally-Ho Movie Theater opened, also segregated. So Leesburg's most illustrious resident ever was, without a doubt, General George C. Marshall. He was the U.S. Army Chief of Staff during World War II, and he retired in November of 45 after the end of the war. But during the war, in the spring of 41, he and his wife, Catherine, purchased the house known as Dodonna Manor, which is on Edwards Ferry. It's actually between Edwards Ferry Road and Market Street. Following the war, Marshall served as Special Envoy to China, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense. And in 1953, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for the post-war European Economic Recovery Plan that bears his name, the Marshall Plan. He remains the only soldier to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was in residence at Dodonna Manor when he received the telegram informing him that he had received it. And in 1956, he spoke at the dedication of the World War II and Korean War Memorial on the Loudoun County Courthouse grounds. This is a picture from that ceremony It stands next to the World War I memorial on the south side of the courthouse. Marshall lived at Devon until his death in 1959. And following his death, his wife, Catherine, moved to North Carolina. She gave the house to her daughter, Molly Wynn. And Mrs. Wynn sold the house to the George C. Marshall International Center in 1995. And after a 10-year restoration, they opened it as a historic house museum, and it is open to tourists today. And I highly recommend that you go visit it because they have restored it to the period. I mean, the house has a much longer history, preceding the Marshalls owning it. It was a girls' school. There's a lot of history there, but they've restored it to the period in which the Marshalls lived there in the 40s and 50s. Civil rights era. So in 1884, the Leesburg Training School, which was the first public school, purpose-built public school in Loudoun County for African Americans, opened. And this building is located on Union Street. It still exists today. It is owned by Loudoun County. They have very recently leased it to the Loudoun Freedom Center, who will be restoring it under the conservatorship program to open it to use it for programming and training programs. In 1930, this building was expanded to include high school classes, but it wasn't an accredited high school. It was never an accredited high school. And a group of African-American parents raised $4,000 to purchase land to build an accredited high school. And they purchased the land on East Market Street. They sold the property to the Loudoun County School Board for $1. And the school board then drug its feet on building a school. And after facing legal action, the threat of legal action, they finally borrowed $30,000 from the State Literary Fund to build Douglas High School, which opened in 1941. And so then the Union Street School became just an elementary school at that point. In 1954, Loudoun County schools consolidated. Prior to that, each magisterial district within the county had its own school system, had some schools. It became a consolidated county school system in 1954. In 1958, Frederick Douglass Elementary School off Sycamore Road, what is now Old Sycamore Road, opened. That building was demolished, probably 10 years ago. And the new two-story Frederick Douglass Elementary School exists on that site today. In the lobby of that school is an excellent exhibit of the segregation and desegregation of Loudoun County schools. And if you ever get a chance to go see it, I highly recommend it. So the training school closed in 1958, and in 1968, Loudoun County schools were finally desegregated, and the Frederick Douglass Elementary School was closed. Actually, I think it became a desegregated school for a while, but it eventually just became a storage facility until it was demolished.
Training facility.
Until it was demolished.
This building in the top is still open up, isn't it?
It's not open. They're working on restoring the building, that hopefully it will be open.
Okay.
But the Loudoun Freedom Center has holds the lease on that now and is working to raise money for the restoration. So legal civil rights. In 1933, a man named George Crawford, a Black man, was accused of murdering a Middleburg socialite and her maid, both of whom were white women. And the NAACP hired Charles Houston, who was the first general counsel at NAACP and dean of the Howard Law School, to try this case, to defend Mr. Crawford. He led the first all-Black legal team on a major case in the South. Given the overwhelming of Crawford's guilt, Houston focused his efforts on sparing Crawford from the death penalty. And he was successful in doing that. And that was considered a major success. The other thing that Houston did during this trial was he successfully exposed the systemic exclusion of qualified Black citizens from jury pools. And that laid the groundwork for a Supreme Court decision a few years later that biased jury selection was unconstitutional. Now, one of the men who served on this case, he was a student at Howard University at the time, and he served as a researcher on Houston's legal team, was a man named Thurgood Marshall, who was, of course, a later Supreme Court justice. And Marshall later said that that serving on this trial, this legal team, was one of the things that led him to focus his career on civil rights. Several years after the Crawford case, Houston was approached by a group of Loudoun County parents regarding the school, and so he was the one who helped them, get the school system to actually build Douglas High School. Unfortunately, Houston did not live to see school segregation declared unconstitutional in 1954. Houston died of a heart attack in 1950. So, other major milestones in the civil rights era here in Leesburg. In 1961, Leesburg lunch counters were integrated following Middleburg's. And the reason Middleburg integrated theirs was because they had two very high-profile, famous people who came to Middleburg a lot during those years. President John Kennedy and his wife Jackie. And Middleburg didn't want the press of, or any, upset, and they didn't want to have a sit-in. So they just very quietly integrated the lunch counters, and Leesburg followed suit. A couple of years later, following some protests, the Tally Ho Movie Theater and the Village Lanes Bowling Center both integrated as well. Unfortunately, the Leesburg Fire Company, which owned a public swimming pool off of Loudon Street, declined to integrate their pool, and they closed it instead, and they filled it in. And all that same year, the Balch Library integrated. In 1976, John Colbert became the first African-American town council member. And in 1992, that I Have a Dream Committee organized Loudon's first annual Martin Luther King Day March, an event that takes place every year since then. And it goes from the courthouse to the Douglas School, and then they have a program at the Douglas School. And if you walk along that path, you will see at the beginning and the end, there are plaques in the sidewalk, one at the beginning and one at the end that have quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King. And then there are engraved bricks every so often along that path, marking that trail. So Leesburg is fortunate to own and operate its own executive airport, and it has an interesting history. So in 1918, a World War plane landed in a grassy field on Wallace George's farm just east of Leesburg. It's a barnstormer. These folks would fly around and offer people rides, right? They'd land someplace, they'd offer people rides. And so on this map, so you can see downtown Leesburg here, right? This is Everett's Ferry Road. And then here is this landing strip marked on this USGS quadrangle map. And so it became known as George's Field. It was a privately run airstrip. Now, at the time, radio personality Arthur Godfrey, there it goes, owned a home in what is now Beacon Hill. And he had a radio show in New York City, and he used to fly his plane from New York City to Leesburg back and forth. And so he purchased George's Field and then gave it to the town on the condition that it continued to be used as an airport, as an airfield, so that he could fly in and out easily. But by the 1960s, this is really slow. Development was encroaching upon the airport. Sounds really familiar right now. And the town applied for a grant from the FAA to build a new modern airport south of town, which is now being encroached upon by development. And Godfrey allowed the town then to sell the existing airport, the one he had given to the town, as long as we used the money to build the new one. This is a photograph of the airport committee The second from the right is Stanley Calkins, the late Stanley Calkins, and the man on the far right is Frank Rappa. This picture was taken at the groundbreaking for the new airport. And the new Godfrey Field was dedicated in October of 1964. And then in 2000, it was renamed the Leesburg Executive Airport at Godfrey Field. And this is a photo that a pilot took on approach into the airport a couple of years ago. So you can see the development of the airfield since the 1960s. Post-war growth. So in 1949, Colonial Leesburg was a nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation of the early American buildings in downtown Leesburg. And the group was instrumental in the brick sidewalks becoming sort of the standard in downtown. In 1958, we annexed an additional little over 1,700 acres. So then this is a town map from 1962. You can see some of the residential development outside of the downtown. Lowenbach had been developed. Waverly Heights had been developed south of town. The Fairview, Wilson, Pershing streets, they're on the west side of town.
What's the date on that?
1962.
That was 1962.
1962. In 1959, we adopted our first zoning ordinance. In 1962, Dulles Airport opened. And the reason I mention this is because Dulles Airport has been a huge driver of the growth of Leesburg. Remember, I mentioned that from 1880 to 1950, the town didn't grow at all. We were about 1,700 people. Well, since the 1950s, the opening of the airport and later the opening of Dulles Greenway, our population has skyrocketed. In 1963, the Olden Historic District was established. This actually predates the creation of the National Register. Oops. Sorry. Let's go back. The creation of the National Register of Historic Places by 3 years. So this is a local ordinance that protects these buildings that requires people to maintain the buildings with a certain aesthetic. So this is the this map shows the current boundaries of the town. The dotted green line that you see there in the center, that is the original Nicholas Minor plat of the town. And then that beige area is the Olden Historic District. And then this is, so, and this is the current boundaries of the Olden Historic District.
What's the date of adoption? No.
This is the current map. In 1968, the W&OD Railroad ceased operations. And in 1974, the first section of it was converted, was completed as a conversion of the W&OD Trail. The last section was completed in 1988. And so it is a trail that runs from Alexandria to Percival on the bed of the old W&OD Railroad.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
On that old historic district, how it expanded, what were like the requirements made them expand in different ways?
So generally, historic preservation looks at buildings that are at least 50 years old. So as time goes on, a building that in 1963 might not have been considered historic because it was built in the 1930s, we would consider historic today. And so, it has expanded. So from late 20th century changes to the town. So in 1984, Market Station development began. This is a conglomeration of historic buildings that have been brought to the site, mill buildings, the old freight station, etc. It was a community development block grant project. So it was largely funded by the federal government. An additional 4,800 acres was annexed, more than doubling the size of Leesburg. So you can see the gold is the original 70 acres or 60 acres. And then the 1814 expansion, the sort of lavender was the 1958. And on all this beige, it's 1984. Then the little bits of colored around have been the ones since then, and mostly have been done to bring schools or specific properties in. So, like Heritage High School on the south, Tuscarora High School, and the other schools up there on the north. In 1986, the Rust family donated 138 acres to the town of their farm for the creation of Ida Lee Park. And this led directly to the creation of the town's Parks and Rec Department. The town hall was built in 1990. In 1995, Dulles Greenway opened, and that really rocketed our growth. 1995, also, the county administration building opened. And then everyone's favorite, 1998, the Outlet Mall. They used to say, when I started with the town, they said that it attracted 5 million visitors a year. I don't know what it attracts today. I don't know if that's gone up or down. More people buying stuff online. I will tell you, though, that we still, on Black Friday, the police are out there directing traffic. So some early 21st century changes. So what's happened since 2000, since I started with the town? I started in 2002. So since then, since 2000, we've added 3 elementary schools, 1 middle school, 2 high schools. This is Tuscarora High School in the north. We've added 6,000 new housing units in developments like River Point and Crescent Place, which is where the old Barber and Ross window door manufacturer used to be, King Street Station. So this is, we've added, single family homes and townhomes and condos. And we've added 2 million square feet of new retail space, 1 million square feet of new office space, and 1.5 million square feet of additional new commercial space, vet clinics and daycares and self-storage facilities and flex industrial space. This is a picture of the village at Leesburg, which opened in 2009. So what's coming down the pike for Leesburg? Well, right now we have about 2 million additional square feet of non-residential space in the pipeline, and about 2,100 additional housing units still in the pipeline. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, well, in terms of housing units, is any of the housing units designed so that people can afford them?
That's a good question. No, seriously, obviously our housing market is market driven. And here in Virginia, we have, relatively limited opportunities to, unless there's a lot of public money put into housing, there are opportunities to create affordable housing, but fewer opportunities to create what we call attainable housing, for the average person to own. I will tell you that the average new house built last year in Leesburg had a price tag of $1.2 million.
It's a single.
That's a single family home. Single family homes built in Meadowbrook and White Oak averaged $1.2 million.
And I have one more question. I understand there's a proposal on the old town dump, which is now the parking lot, to build, among other things, a performance hall, which this town desperately needs. Too bad we tore down that opera house. Do you know anything about that?
Well, I know that that the town put out a request for proposals to do a public-private partnership, and that discussions are ongoing with the folks who submitted a proposal on that. We have done some environmental testing. We did some test drilling on the site to see because it's an old dump, what's down there. And so I don't know precisely where it is, but I do know that things are moving on that.
Oh, great.
So
thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Is that project still alive that's been lingering for a while, that incorporated the Loudon Times Mirror building next to the parking?
It is. So that's called Church and Market, and they have demolished the back half of the old Loudon Times Mirror building. And so it would incorporate, I want to say, about 30,000 square feet of non-residential space and 116 apartments.
Where is it?
The old Loudon Times Mirror building next to the downtown post office? on Market Street, on East Market Street, right across from the courthouse. And so that property actually extends all the way to Loudon Street. So sort of between Market and Loudon and Church Street, where Church Street is really kind of an alley right there, a one-way alley. Yes, ma'am.
Well, in regards to Church and Market, will that be the first 6-story building? That's my observation. It just occurred to me looking at all this historic.
Right.
I've read
hillside.
Well, because of the grade, it's,
Oh, really?
So I mean, it goes down, so it goes up, so it won't break the line of sight from the courthouse.
Thank you.
yeah. So, since you're looking at the old Loudon Times Mirror building, you won't see 5 stories above that.
Okay.
Right. But if you're standing at Church and Loudon, you would see 5 stories, but you're way down. Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything going to be done on Adams Creek, across from where the Truist Bank is? Now, where Outlaw Park is, just to the north side or to the
So Town Bridge.
yeah.
So that is, you're talking about like,
Between the
you're talking south of Catoctin or north of Catoctin? South of Catoctin. So like along where the bowling alley is?
between the bowling alley and the Truist Bank, there's
The Town Bridge. Right. It's privately owned. So that is owned by the folks who own the bowling alley property.
Great.
Oh, Town Bridge.
Well, at one point, sometime last fall, I saw a sign on it saying the proposal will go to a town meeting, and then it just disappeared. But
Right. So it was they probably had some sort of special exception or, zoning action taking place.
Can't be just continued.
Well, so Virginia Village, the redevelopment of Virginia Village, they're going to be donating or deeding the portion along Town Branch that is between Catoctin and Rathlow Park. Because Rathlow Park doesn't go all the way to Catoctin Circle. They're going to be deeding that to the town, and it will be an extension of Rathlow Park.
Okay.
But south of Catoctin, I'm not aware of any plans to do anything. So, yes, sir.
Any plans to have a hard copy walking guide that covers a lot of these historic properties in Leesburg? I know we're missing that because Personville has a historic walking guide of their town.
Mhm.
The visitor guide for the county is, covers a lot of different things at really high level. But I volunteered at the Loudoun County Museum. I've had folks come in and say, this is some really neat properties here. What are they?
Right.
And I can explain them, but I can only do so
Right.
much because they really need a map with something that describes it. And personally, like I was at Harvard to Grace, and they have a map with a guide.
Right.
It's called the Lafayette Trail,
Mhm.
and it's great. You just walk around the streets and it
Yeah.
points out the history.
So there is a book called Exploring Leesburg. Are there still copies of that available?
yes, there are still, it's a little red book.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So there's that that's available. And then, thank you for the segue. We have a virtual walking tours. And so you don't have to download the app to do this. You can do it on your smartphone just using your browser. But if you go to leesburgva.gov/walking tour, the architecture report is not active yet. I'm desperately trying to get that one launched. It's ready to go. We need to record the audio for it.
Okay, that's why I'm sorry to interrupt here. I just want to mention one more point on this because the app, I love apps and I can use them, but when you're outside and it's sunny, you can't read and see the screen.
Right.
Although in this book, I have this is great, but it's when I got it was $5. I don't know. I don't think it's a complimentary. So what happens is for visitors coming in, if you have a chance to be in the
Right.
pipeline of someone that is interested to try to.
No, thank you for bringing that up.
Great to have you.
Because, we tend to, in today's world, go, oh, well, nobody uses printed stuff anymore. Right? It's all on your phone. But you do make a good point. And one of the reasons I haven't launched the architectural tour is because the other tours, they all have audio so that you don't have to read your screen. that you can just listen to the tour as you hit each site. So
This audio, this has audio?
these have audio. So the architecture tour I haven't launched yet because I need to find somebody to. I had somebody volunteer to record it for me, and I hadn't heard back from them. So anyway,
We also do have a couple printed walking tours. There's this one opening door from Leesburg's history, or the first Friday that's upstairs to the historic district. So there are some printouts available.
Yeah.
all right. Well, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I've seen some photos of old homes on Loudon Street where this big garage is now. Do you know when those homes moved into them?
Where the town garage is?
So that, in that block between King Street and between the Donaldson.
Right. So that would have been in the late 1980s. The garage and the town hall opened in 1990.
Town hall is where the garage is now. One story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. So, other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know what percentage of size-wise is Leesburg compared to Loudoun County
Area or population?
area?
Area. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. We're about 12 square miles. Yes, sir.
County is 330,000 acres.
Okay, so we're 8,000 acres. Loudoun County is 330,000 acres.
Okay.
What?
We can do the math.
Okay, that's okay. Thank you.
Yes, I saw him back there. Yes, ma'am.
Who did you get your picture? Original.
So a variety of. Oh, sorry.
You said the original presenter just told stories based on the pictures.
Right, and so I've replaced a lot of the pictures. So a lot of the photos came from Thomas Balch Library. A lot of the modern photos I took. I think actually most of the historic photos came from historic images came from the Balch. Yes, ma'am.
This is not exactly history, but you mentioned the 2,100 new homes.
Uh-huh.
Is there a point at which the town is considered built out? I've heard that phrase before, but I never know what it means.
Right. So, so about 90% of our land has been developed in some way or another. So there's like 10% of what we would call greenfield site left, where there's been no development. It's just fallow land. But what's going to happen is that, and we're already seeing it, is that there will be redevelopment. So like Virginia Village is redeveloping, and other areas that, are older, less dense development, there will be redevelopment. And so the idea of true build out, it really doesn't exist because there will continue to be new development and change. But just so you know, about 90% of the town has been developed, a little over 90%. So, other questions? Well, thank you all for joining. Your questions have given me some things that I'm going to need to research and add to my presentation. Yes, sir.
And an invitation, you did a nice summary of the Battle of Bulls Bluff. We have volunteers who give guided tours Saturdays and Sundays during April to Thanksgiving at 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock, Saturdays and Sundays. So feel free to come out and take a nice one mile stroll around the four corners of the battlefield.